General Hospital spoilers teased that something in Port Charles had changed, not with the thunder of an explosion or the bang of a gunshot, but with a slow, creeping erosion, like watching a mirror crack from the inside, quietly and relentlessly. The collapse of deception was no longer a hypothetical threat whispered in boardrooms or tossed around during tense staff meetings. It was real, tangible, inescapable. And the unraveling of the once iconic brand felt like the end of something much larger than just a cosmetics empire. It felt like the end of an era, an identity, a dream. Deception had been more than a company. To Lucy, it was the resurrection of her youth and a symbol of her resilience. To Maxie, it was a second chance, at reinvention, at independence. At proving she could thrive outside of shadows that once swallowed her whole. And to Brook Lynn, it was the first serious step she had taken into a world built on more than just music and legacy. But that world was collapsing now, and no amount of eyeliner, blush, or branding campaigns could hide the blemishes that had become too pronounced to ignore. The numbers didn't lie. The books were unbalanced. The accounts had been quietly compromised. The investments Sonny made, whether accidental or deliberate, had long left traces of criminal taint. Natalia Ramirez had known it. She tried to speak about it before her sudden death, whispering the truth like a warning to Brook Lynn, who had dismissed it at the time as paranoia born from exhaustion. But now, in the chilling silence of Natalia's absence, every word felt prophetic. Her death, too sudden, too convenient, cast a long shadow not only over Sonny but over everyone linked to Deception's financial structure. The collapse wasn't just fiscal. It was moral, emotional, and existential. And as if the universe had decided that wasn't enough destruction for one summer in Port Charles, another whisper began to circulate, growing louder with each passing day: Kirsten Storms. The woman who breathed life into Maxie for nearly 2 decades, was stepping away from the role. Temporarily, perhaps. But the timing was a cruel irony. Just as Maxie's world was falling apart on screen, her departure off-screen sent tremors through the fanbase and creative team alike. The parallel between actor and character created an unsettling duality, as if Maxie was vanishing from both fiction and reality at once. Within the fictional confines of the story, Maxie stood at a crossroads. The dismantling of Deception had gutted her, not just professionally, but personally. The company had been her salvation after Nathan's death, a way to reclaim her purpose. Every press kit, every launch party, every challenge overcome had become part of her fabric. Watching it disintegrate under legal threats, media scrutiny, an internal betrayal felt like losing a loved one. And now, with Natalia's death being investigated, and Sonny possibly facing federal charges, the pressure to survive was becoming too much. Lucy tried to hold it together, delivering pep talks in the mirror and forcing smiles that felt like they'd crack her face. Tracy, as cold and calculating as ever, suggested immediate dissolution. "Better we tear it down ourselves than let the feds do it for us," she'd said with a finality that chilled the room. Brook Lynn oscillated between panic and practicality, trying to plan exit strategies that didn't feel like surrender. And Maxie? Maxie stood still, paralyzed. As if every step forward would pull her deeper into something she wasn't ready to face. The whispers about Maxie's possible exit were not confined to boardrooms or back alleys. They reached the viewers, the fans, the heartbeat of General Hospital. Forums lit up with questions. Was she really leaving? Would Maxie return? Was this the end of the road, or just a pause before a reinvention? The ambiguity of it all only fed the sense that Port Charles was entering a new phase, one defined by uncertainty, haunting transitions, and emotional ghost towns. Natalia's death added a sinister undertone to everything. Her warnings, dismissed in life, became sacred texts after she was gone. Marco Rios, her son, made it his mission to avenge her. And in doing so, exposed the corruption she died trying to reveal. His crusade, though justified, added fuel to an already raging fire. With his help, federal prosecutors unearthed enough evidence to freeze Deception's accounts, launch a criminal probe, and link Sunny's investment trail back to other enterprises long suspected of illicit ties. And the women of deception? They weren't just bystanders. They were now witnesses. Possibly accomplices. Justine Turner, the determined interim DA, offered them a brutal bargain. Full immunity in exchange for full cooperation. That meant testifying against Sunny. That meant admitting their business had been tainted. That meant signing the death certificate for deception with their own hands. Lucy protested, as she always did, hopeful for some last-minute miracle. Maxie, eyes hollow, didn't fight. Brook Lynn signed her name with a trembling hand. And Tracy, who had seen the writing on the wall weeks ago, had already packed her portfolio. The haunting had begun. There was something deeply unsettling about watching a dream die, not with rage or fireworks, but with paperwork, silence, and resignation. The building that once housed Deception's headquarters had begun to empty. The makeup stations were cleared. The glass walls no longer reflected ambition but regret. The logo, elegant, fierce, feminine, still clung to the front desk, like a ghost unaware that the world had moved on without her. As Maxie prepared to leave Port Charles, perhaps for a job overseas, perhaps for clarity, perhaps to protect her children, she walked through those empty halls one last time. The echoes of laughter, late-night brainstorming sessions, and arguments that once filled the space seemed louder in their absence. Her heels clicked against the floor like a countdown. This wasn't just the end of a company. It was the end of an identity she had fought so hard to rebuild. The fans watching knew what they were witnessing. Not just the unraveling of a plotline, but the culmination of decades of emotional investment. Maxie was a legacy character. Deception was a legacy brand. Natalia's death was more than a narrative twist, it was a catalyst for profound transformation. And now, Port Charles stood on the brink of a new season, one without one of its most defining voices. So much had changed. And yet, so much was unresolved. Would Sunny survive the legal onslaught? Would Lucy find another passion project to throw herself into? Would Brook Lynn follow through on managing Joe's career, or fall back into old patterns? Would Maxie ever return, and if she did, who would she be after walking away from the ashes? The viewers were left with more questions than answers, their hearts aching not just from the loss of what was, but from the fear of what might never be again. The end of Deception wasn't just a storyline. It was a wound. The death of Natalia wasn't just a plot device. It was a reckoning. And Maxie's exit wasn't just a hiatus. It was a goodbye that felt too final, too abrupt, too layered in sorrow to be ignored. As the credits rolled and the screen faded to black, there was no dramatic score, no cliffhanger explosion. Just silence. A silence heavy with loss, change, and the eerie sense that Port Charles had entered a new era, one where everything familiar was slipping away. An era haunted by what had been lost. And by the unknown that lay ahead. Brook Lynn stood in the center of what once was the heartbeat of Deception, a space that used to breathe ambition and sparkle with the shimmer of bold ideas and feminine power. But now, everything felt still. Not a peaceful stillness, but the kind that came after something had been broken and no one dared to speak of it. The walls that once echoed with the sound of collaboration now carried only the weight of silence. That silence was louder than any siren. It pressed down on her chest, reminding her of what had been lost, and of what she still might lose if she didn't act, now. There was a deep, gnawing terror that had begun to take hold of Brook Lynn in recent days. It wasn't just about the crumbling infrastructure of a company, this was about legacy, about family, about identity. Deception wasn't just a cosmetics brand. It was a symbol of second chances. It was her stake in something larger than herself, something she believed could outlast past failures and echo into the future. But now, that symbol was cracking, and the cracks were beginning to expose more than just bad investments or legal risks. They were exposing weakness, regret, and the deeply buried fear that Brook Lynn had spent years trying to drown out, the fear that she would never be enough. Not for her family. Not for herself. The collapse of deception was no longer abstract. It had a pulse. It had a scent, burnt-out dreams, dissolved trust. And the sour rot of betrayal that came from not asking the right questions soon enough. Brook Lynn knew she had been complicit. Not in crime, no, but in avoidance, in hesitation. In pretending things would sort themselves out if she just stayed quiet long enough. That era of silence was over now. The time for action had come. And Brook Lynn was running out of both options and allies. That's when her thoughts turned to Sasha. Sasha had been through hell and back, more times than anyone should. She had lost a child. Lost her mind, and clawed her way back from grief with a resilience that was as raw as it was inspiring. If anyone knew how to survive a storm like this, it was her. Brook Lynn didn't hesitate. She picked up the phone, hands trembling, heart pounding. There was no time to weigh the risks. What she needed was someone who understood the high-stakes emotional cost of collapse, and someone who hadn't yet given up. When Sasha answered, Brook Lynn didn't even know what to say at first. But the silence between them was filled with recognition. They were both standing at the edge of something monumental, something frightening, something they couldn't face alone. Brook Lynn confessed everything, the growing fear that deception would be dissolved, the shame of her own inaction, the files Natalia had once hinted at. And the way those whispers had become screams since her death. She told Sasha she was haunted, not by ghosts, but by the weight of unrealized potential.
By the legacy she was on the verge of letting vanish into nothing. Sasha didn't flinch. She listened. She felt. And then she responded, not with pity,
but with a quiet determination that had become her trademark. This wasn't the first time she'd been asked to step into chaos. But this time, she chose to do it. Not for glory. Not for redemption. But because she believed in Brook Lynn. Because she believed deception didn't deserve to die this way. That was the beginning of something new. A mission. A pact. A rebirth. Together. They formed a plan, one that involved retracing every financial misstep, speaking with Natalia's contacts, and even confronting Sunny if necessary. This wasn't just about saving a company anymore. It was about reclaiming control over the narrative that had been written for them by others. It was about fighting back against a world that still tried to reduce women to survivors instead of allowing them to be warriors. Brook Lynn knew the odds were stacked against them. The federal investigation was intensifying. Turner wasn't letting up. Tracy was already gone, pulling her money and her influence back into ELQ. Lucy was fading, buried in denial. And Maxie was gone too, headed towards some unknown future far away from Port Charles, leaving behind a space that could never be fully filled. But Brook Lynn had chosen her path. She would not be the girl who stood by and watched everything burn down around her. Not this time. Not again. And with Sasha at her side, something about the despair started to shift. It didn't go away, but it morphed. It hardened into resolve. Together, they would dig through the ashes. Together, they would find the truth. Together, they would rebuild, or at the very least. They would not go down quietly. This new mission wasn't just about business. It was about integrity. It was about the future. And it had already begun. Whether they succeeded or not. Brook Lynn knew one thing with absolute clarity. She was no longer running from the ghosts of her past. She was confronting them. And that, more than anything, was the real beginning of change. Brook Lynn had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let deception die. Not without a fight. Not while it still carried the legacy of every woman who had poured her soul into it. The building might have been emptying out, the contracts may have started crumbling, and the headlines might already be sharpening their knives, but for Brook Lynn, surrender was no longer on the table. What she felt rising inside her now wasn't fear, it was fire. The collapse of deception wasn't just about financial missteps or Sunny's tainted investments. It had become something else entirely. It had evolved into a symbol of everything that had gone unspoken for too long, about identity, survival, female power, and the illusion of control. And now, the battle for that identity had become personal. A haunting force was in motion. A shift. A recalibration of power. The air in Port Charles felt different. As if the past itself was being rewritten. Rearranged, undone. Brook Lynn could feel the weight of it on her chest, but she refused to be paralyzed by it. She was not going to let deception be remembered as a cautionary tale. She would fight for it to be reborn. It wasn't just about salvaging a company. It was about restoring a sense of purpose, a kind of redemption. Her redemption. But even as she steeled herself for the battle ahead, Lucy was spiraling. What once made Lucy a fearless visionary, the ability to dream in color, to charge ahead with blind hope, was now becoming her undoing. The cracks were beginning to show. Lucy's hope had become desperation. Her defiance was turning volatile. She started lashing out, at Tracy, at Brook Lynn, even at herself. One minute she was planning a comeback campaign that made no sense in the current legal landscape. And the next she was ranting about betrayal, conspiracy, and how everyone had abandoned her. Her attacks weren't strategic, they were emotional. And in that emotional storm, Lucy had become unpredictable. Brook Lynn saw the unraveling up close. She tried to reason with Lucy, to remind her that they still had a chance, if only they worked together. But Lucy wouldn't hear it. Every suggestion felt like an insult. Every offer of help was twisted into a threat. Lucy had become consumed by the idea that everyone was trying to steal deception from her when, in truth, everyone else had simply given up. Everyone except Brook Lynn. This wasn't just a professional crisis anymore, it was psychological. Deception had become a haunted house. Filled with the ghosts of dreams that had once shone so brightly but now flickered like dying candles. But Brook Lynn refused to let those ghosts claim her. Instead, she chose to walk through the ruins, to see them for what they were, reminders of what mattered. Of what still could matter, if someone was brave enough to confront the pain instead of fleeing from it. And so, while Lucy fought invisible enemies and Tracy closed every door she had once opened, Brook Lynn began a different kind of war. A quieter one. One fought with strategy, empathy, and determination. She started reviewing the finances herself. She pulled in new contacts, made cold calls, drafted press releases that didn't beg for pity but demanded respect. She reached out to Sasha again, this time with a clearer plan, not just to fix what was broken, but to remake it entirely. This was the new haunting, not the collapse, but the transformation. Brook Lynn realized that sometimes, to fight for something, you had to let it fall apart first. You had to strip it down, tear away the glamour, confront the rot. Only then could you build something real. And maybe, just maybe, deception had never truly been real until now. Maybe all of this pain was the price of authenticity. Lucy wasn't ready to see that yet. She was still clinging to the past. Still terrified of the new. And that terror had turned her from a mentor into a liability. But Brook Lynn? She had already crossed the line. She had stepped into the fire. She was no longer trying to escape the haunting, she was learning how to walk through it. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a calling. A new chapter was beginning in Port Charles. One shaped not by glossy campaigns or false smiles, but by grit, sacrifice, and truth. The haunting was here to stay. But Brook Lynn was done running from it. She was embracing it, using it. And in that shift, everything was changing. Not just deception. Not just Lucy. But Brook Lynn herself. The girl who once hesitated to speak now roared in boardrooms. The woman who once questioned her worth now stood firm with purpose. And as she looked ahead, into the uncertainty, into the mess,
into the aftermath, Brook Lynn saw not just wreckage, but potential. A new mission. A new beginning. A new kind of deception. One that would be built on truth. On pain. On power. And this time,
no one would take it from her. Brook Lynn and Sasha had both stared into the abyss before, but never like this. What they were now preparing to face was not just a public relations nightmare or a cosmetic rebranding effort, it was a full-scale war for the soul of deception. This wasn't just about lipstick or marketing. This was about money. And money, in Port Charles, always came with bloodstains. The numbers were worse than anyone had anticipated. The company's reserves were nearly dry. The influx of illegal funds tied to Sunny's silent investment had corrupted the books beyond repair. Loans that had once been quietly co-signed were now ticking time bombs. Private equity backers had vanished overnight, and the whispers in the financial sector were merciless. The word fraud was beginning to circulate, and with Natalia Ramirez dead, there was no longer a buffer between deception and the full weight of federal scrutiny. But Brook Lynn refused to back down. She had already sacrificed too much, her pride, her peace, her future. Deception wasn't just a business to her anymore. It had become her line in the sand. And Sasha, though scarred from past traumas, knew exactly what it meant to fight for something worth saving. This wasn't about rebuilding what they once had, it was about transforming it into something stronger. Something untouchable. The alliance between them had once been tentative, formed out of mutual need. Now it was forged by something deeper, loyalty, determination. And the aching recognition that no one else was coming to save them. Tracy had walked away. Lucy had gone off the rails. Maxie had disappeared into her own emotional exile. It was just the two of them now, two women who had been burned by the world too many times to count, now choosing to walk back into the fire for the sake of something bigger than themselves. Brook Lynn started working around the clock, reviewing vendor contracts, calling in every favor her last name could still earn her, and negotiating down debts line by line. But the real enemy wasn't the creditors. It was the narrative, the perception that deception was already dead. If the town believed it, then it might as well be true. And that's where Sasha came in. Sasha had once been the face of deception. She knew the power of image, of grace under pressure, of being both vulnerable and unbreakable. She agreed to return, not just as a model, but as a partner. A co-leader. A symbol that the company wasn't retreating, it was rising. But even as they took steps to relaunch, new problems emerged. The money trail Natalia had left behind had led federal investigators to uncover further discrepancies, shell companies, shadow accounts. And a second layer of financial manipulation that neither Brook Lynn nor Sasha had expected. This wasn't just about deception anymore. It was about exposing who had been using the company to launder funds, and why. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous the truth became. Someone had used deception to funnel dirty money into real estate projects across the state. It was bigger than Sunny. Bigger than Natalia. And if Brook Lynn and Sasha couldn't get ahead of it, they wouldn't just lose the company, they could go down with it. Still, they pushed forward. They knew the relaunch would have to be bold, unapologetic, and steeped in transparency. No more cover-ups. No more lies. They began drafting a press event, one that would announce not only the return of deception but its rebirth under new leadership, new values, and a clean financial foundation. But even that plan wasn't safe for long. Just days before the scheduled event, a leak hit the media.
Internal documents suggesting Brook Lynn had known about the illegal money trail for months and had hidden it. It wasn't true, not fully, but the damage was instant.
Brook Lynn's name trended for all the wrong reasons. Sasha's involvement was called into question. Investors began pulling out again. The fire they thought they'd tamed had roared back to life. Twice as vicious. That night, alone in the empty office, Brook Lynn finally broke. All the strength, the strategy, the false smiles she'd held up for weeks, it all collapsed in one sharp breath. She looked at the framed deception logo on the wall and whispered, "I don't know if I can save you." But Sasha did. She found Brook Lynn, sat beside her, and reminded her why they were doing this. Not for money. Not for fame. But for survival. For every woman who had been told to sit down, shut up, and walk away quietly. They weren't going to disappear. They were going to fight. Even if the world thought they were finished. Together, they rewrote the press event. They didn't hide the truth, they led with it. They acknowledged the collapse, the pain, the betrayal. And then they unveiled their plan, a new deception. Smaller. Sleeker. Fully independent. They revealed a new investor, anonymous but vetted. They pledged full cooperation with the federal investigation. They declared war on the narrative that women couldn't recover from scandal unless they disappeared. And by the end of the week, their gamble began to shift the tide. The media, hungry for redemption arcs, latched onto the story. Survivors rebuilding. Fighters pushing back. Port Charles, stunned into silence for so long, began whispering again, but this time, in awe. What Brook Lynn and Sasha had done wasn't just salvage a company. They had sparked a movement. But the war was far from over.
Someone was still pulling strings behind the scenes. Someone who wanted deception gone permanently. And the money problem? It hadn't been solved, only redirected. The next battle was coming.
And it would be even darker. But Brook Lynn and Sasha were ready. They were no longer just co-owners. They were soldiers. And this mission, they would not lose. Not this time. Not again.